Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be providing an update to the bull market support band. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, really a couple of interesting weeks here because Bitcoin closed above its bull market support band 2 weeks ago and continued it last week. So it closed above it again. Now, we have seen this before, right? We actually saw it back over here in July, right? We had a weekly close above it. And then the following week, we had another close above it. And then the following week, Bitcoin just went right back below it, right? And that week, actually, you can see that was the week of July 29th, which would have led into, right, getting all the labor market data, right? The labor market data would, comes in at around the beginning of the month. And so that's going to be something to keep an eye on here. You can also see that Bitcoin got above its bull market support band here in August of, or all the week of August 19th. But then the following week, right, August 26th, going into the beginning of September, Bitcoin gave it right back, right? So this is going to be a really important week because Bitcoin hasn't actually had 3 weekly closes above the 20-week SMA in a row, right, since June. So it's been a while. And right now, just so you guys are aware, in case there is a pullback this week, we do have the labor market data coming in. The 20-week SMA is now at 62.8K. The 21-week EMA is at 61.5K. So there's definitely a little wiggle room, right? I mean, Bitcoin could even drop another 2 to 3 grand and still technically be above the 21-week EMA. So, there's a little bit of wiggle room built in. We're gonna get, job openings and hires and quits and the unemployment rate and all that stuff this week. So we'll see where it all comes in, right? And this is one of those things where it could be a long, grueling process in terms of figuring it out. So one of the things we have to remember is that markets generally trend up, and I've said this many, many times, right? They generally trend up. They need a reason not to, right? They don't really need a reason to go up. They need a reason to go down. And that's why if you look at like the S&P 500 throughout all of history, it generally trends up. It needs a reason to go down, right? And sometimes those reasons are recessions, right? Like you can see highlighted in the green here. And then other times they're not, right? Other times you just get, 1987 there was a huge drop that sort of kicked off in August, and then it bottomed out in October. And back then, the S&P, I think, dropped like 35% or something, which is kind of crazy that it dropped 35% and there wasn't, a recession associated with it. But it goes to show that the market can go down for all sorts of reasons, right? Sometimes it goes down when there's a recession. Sometimes it goes down just because it wants to go down for a little while or because there's some reason, right? So we have to remember that the market, generally speaking, right? Generally speaking, the markets trend higher for assets that are, I guess, worthwhile, in the first place. You could certainly argue there's like meme coins and that kind of stuff where maybe they go higher for a little while, but then they just basically go asymptotically to zero over long enough period of time because people just forget about them and they move on to something else. So when I say the markets generally trend higher, I'm referring to like the stock market and even for Bitcoin. Generally speaking, it trends higher. It needs a reason not to. And every one of these major bear markets that Bitcoin has had, there's been a pretty compelling reason why it was going down, right? Over here, it was all the fraud associated with, not only FTX, but a lot of the apps that were promising yield and whatnot that ended up going under, ended up going bankrupt. A lot of people lost their crypto. And so that's a reason why, right? As a reason why that the market went down. And you could basically make the claims for every single major bear market that Bitcoin's gone through. Even in 2018, it was after the ICO mania, where everyone and their moms were launching these ICOs, and just printing or making a WordPress site and printing as many different projects, tokens as they could. And, I think people caught wind of that, and we needed a bear market to wash it out. So, yeah, I mean, occasionally Bitcoin goes into these bear markets, but it needs a reason to do so. So, like, for instance, if you were to go over to the website and we were just to simply look at the ROI of Bitcoin from the low, right? From the low, this is where Bitcoin has been the last 2 cycles at this point in the cycle, right? I mean, zoom in here. I mean, basically to just within a few, almost exactly the same thing, right? At this point in market cycle 3, the ROI from the low is 4.12x. In the last cycle, it was 4.15, and right now it's 4.07. So, legitimately, as complicated as we all try to make it and whatnot, Bitcoin's ROI from the low was 4x approximately at this point in this cycle at this time, and the last 2 cycles at this time as measured from the low, right? So, when you look at it, if it follows suit and trends higher, it'll be following the last 2 cycles. If it doesn't do that, right? If it doesn't do that, there needs to be a reason why it's not, right? And that's the point, right? If in 3 months, if by the end of December, we're sitting here and we're like, well, Bitcoin is not following this path. Well, why is that, right? I mean, it has to have been because something intervened. If, on the other hand, by the end of December, Bitcoin's tracking like it did the last 2 cycles, it stands to reason that, well, things are still fine. And the markets generally go up unless they have a sufficient reason not to do so. So, all sorts of reasons why. I mean, there's geopolitical risk, but as I said before, there's no point in trying to worry about that headache. The geopolitical stuff, you can't predict it. I can't predict it. I don't really think anyone can predict it. And so it's just not one of those things where it makes a lot of sense to spend a lot of time even thinking about, because I don't really think anyone can predict it anyways. And even if they could predict the geopolitical events, they probably can't predict the market's reaction to them. So I wouldn't put a lot of thought into that. I think the only thing that the market's really going to care about for the next few months is the labor market, right? The unemployment rate. I think that inflation is there and the market will certainly care about. I mean, I think for at least a few months, inflation is it's generally moving in the right direction, right? I mean, if anything, it's been coming in lower, I think, than what people were expecting. And so, I mean, of course, you could end up risking deflation at some point, but I mean, we're clearly not at that point yet. So it seems like that's not the bigger risk right now. It seems like the bigger risk is just the labor market. So, we go into this week, right? We're going into this week, and this is around the time in the last 2 cycles where Bitcoin really started to pick back up again. If you guys remember back to March of 2019, I said, look, guys, at the very least, give it 6 months before this thing can break back out. At least 6 months. I mean, I said 6 to 9 months. 6 to 9 months. It's been 6 months, right? It's been more than 6 months now. And Bitcoin still hasn't technically gotten back on track. I mean, I think you could argue it certainly feels like it has, with Bitcoin, back up at well, I guess it's back down now, back to 64K, but not too long ago it was a 66K. And you could argue that it certainly feels like it's getting back on track. But what I'm talking about is this lower high structure that has not yet broken, right? The same lower high structure, by the way, that occurred in 2019. Okay, same thing. And the reason why I say 6 to 9 months, or I said it back in March, was after about 6 to 7 months is when Bitcoin broke through the lower high structure back then. It was like 6 to 7 months. So it's already been about that long, right? So that's why I said back then 6 to 7 months. But I also know, right? We also know that after the first rate cut last cycle in 2019, Bitcoin rallied for 2 weeks, right? For 2 weeks. And then it sold off. And Bitcoin, this first green week right here was actually before the first rate cut, right? The rate cut occurred in this green candle, right? So we got that green week, and then we got a green week after it. So you could argue that those 2 green weeks were these 2 back in 2019. You could also argue that that's too pessimistic and must be pessimistic. That, right? Why not say, you know what? Maybe the market was just a little bit more efficient at pricing in some of the rate cuts this time, and therefore perhaps it's just ahead. And perhaps rather than being over here, we're already here, and therefore Bitcoin's due to break out of the lower high structure, right? Maybe that's what's going on. So what I would say is this: if Bitcoin breaks through the lower high structure within the next couple of weeks, then I think you can make the claim that it's doing the exact same thing it did in early 2020, right? Yes, we did get a hard landing induced by a pandemic, but you could argue that it's doing the same exact thing. If on the other hand, Bitcoin doesn't even break through the lower high structure, right? If we're just sitting here watching it and everyone's like, well, what the hell? Why is it not breaking through? Maybe it's not because the comparison is failing, right? It just might mean rather than being here, what if we're still back here? It's always a possibility, right? I mean, it's not completely out of the question. So I would keep that in mind, right? I'd keep that in mind. I think it makes sense to be open-minded. Right? I mean, I don't think it makes sense to go into it assuming you know what's going to happen here. I'm just pointing out, these things that we've previously seen. There's other realities, right? There's other realities. If you were to go look at monthly returns for Bitcoin, granted the month's not over, but so far Bitcoin's up about 9%. Right? It's up about 9% so far this month. Again, we're going to get one more day, right? The first day of this week will still be September, but there's not going to be really much labor market data coming out on Monday. At least not that I can think of off the top of my head. I think the first thing that comes out, the first main thing is going to be job openings. That's not until Tuesday, I believe. So, I mean, look, assuming September closes green, last year it also closed green, and then you had a green Q4. And then in 2016 it was green, and you had a green Q4. And it closed green in 2016. 2015 in green Q4. The only time where Bitcoin closed green in September and did not immediately go green in October was all the way back in 2012, right? That was a long time ago. I mean, 2012, you're going all the way back to, way over here, where Bitcoin had a green September, but then, or so that's 2013, 2012, right here, right, where September was green, but then in October, it just came back down to the bull market support band. And then it kind of stayed there even throughout the rest of the year. And it wasn't until the following year where Bitcoin really started to pick back up. So that's why I still say, back to what I said back in March, it could be that 6 to 9 month thing where it's been 6 months already, and you could argue that's enough, right? But if it's not enough, right? If it's not enough, and we're looking at this in December, and it either hasn't broken out of the lower high structure, or it has, but then we ended up coming right back below it, kind of like we did over here, then perhaps the reason is the labor market, right? And look, the labor market is about, is more puzzling than just about anything else right now, because you have initial claims trending close to 200K, which is far from what anyone, I think, rational would consider recessionary. But then on the other hand, you look at the unemployment rate, and if you only look at that, I mean, you look at it and you have to be kind of concerned, right? So my guess is that, if by the end of the year, if Bitcoin is not moving back up and taking out the lower high structure, then it's probably because this is going up, right? if this is kind of settling back down and trending back down, then that would be a good reason for Bitcoin to, sort of disregard the labor market. I mean, because the only real thing, the only hard data that I think has been extremely concerning for the labor market is just the unemployment rate, which is, I mean, as I've said before, is kind of the only thing that actually matters. But I mean, if you look at initial claims, you look at continued claims, um, if you look at even the SOM rule, right? There's still plenty of states where it hasn't triggered, and so in order to have a full blown recession, it really needs to be triggering in basically all of them, or at least most of them. Um, so I mean, it should be an important week, right? This should be a very important week for Bitcoin, and I will reiterate, right? I mean, what again, hope for the best, plan for the worst, right? You don't go into it hoping for anything, bad to happen per se, but it's okay to plan for that kind of stuff. So, what I would say is, if there is a pullback this week, then you're going to want to watch the bull market support band, which again is a couple $1,000s below the current price, right? I mean, the 20-week estimate is only, yeah, it's about a couple $1,000s below the current price, not a little bit less than a couple thousand. So that'll be the important thing to watch. Around that 62K level or so. 62 to 63K is going to be the line in the sand that I imagine the bulls are going to really want to hold. The bears, on the other hand, would very much want to see Bitcoin back below its bull market support band, kind of like it did back over here, right? Right there, going into labor market release. That's ultimately what happened. So, but look, if you get a case where the labor market data comes in bad and Bitcoin sells off back to 62K, but then it holds it as support, then that would be more optimistic for Bitcoin, going into, the months following that, right? Like, again, if it does something like 2012, where it's back above it's above the bull market support band, and then it kind of comes back down to it to hold it as support in October, right? And if it's holding it as support going into the new year still, then that would bode well. But if, on the other hand, it's not holding support on this lower high structure, knocks Bitcoin down again, then it just gets rejected from the highs again, which would exceed what happened in 2019, right? Because the 2019 comparison really ended here after that low. And I tweeted it out back then. I said, look, the 2019 comparison is complete. You had a low, you had a lower low, and you had a lower low after that, right? And that's what happened in 2019. Yes, there was a lower low after all that, but again, it was induced by a pandemic. Now, if Bitcoin were to get another drop like that going into the end of the year, then it would put Bitcoin back at around $42,000, which again just happens to be around where the yearly open is, right? I mean, that's basically where the yearly open is. And so I would certainly keep an eye on that if Bitcoin is unable to follow the general market cycle ROI, right? Because again, and this is kind of how I imagine, the markets generally work anyways, right? I mean, you get to a point where both sides are exhausted, right? The bears are exhausted, the bulls are exhausted. And I mean, at some point, right, there needs to be a winner, right? I mean, there needs to be a winner where either the bull case is right or the bear case is right, because at some point one side's going to give up, right? I mean, you got to have to imagine, right? At some point one side's going to give up. And if Bitcoin can break through and hold support, then the bears probably give up. If it can hold that as support and start breaking through support. If, on the other hand, it just gets rejected again and it comes back down here, then the bulls might start to really show some they might just start to get somewhat weary, right? Getting into all these lower highs and it not leading to anything. And if that ends up happening, right? If that ends up happening and it is just another lower high, I don't really think it's much of a reflection of Bitcoin as it is just, look, people are maybe worried about the labor market. I don't know. All I know is that there's not been very many people who have been right about this entire Bitcoin move. The people that were right about this have been very wrong about this. And a lot of people that were right about this were wrong about this, right? So it's certainly been a tough cycle to get every move correct. But it's funny because enough time passes and, you just go back to the ROI after the low and you're like, well, despite everything, Bitcoin's back to where it always is at this point in the cycle, right? So this is how I imagine that, the markets work. It's basically getting to the point where if Bitcoin wants to go higher, the next few weeks are really where it should prove it's going to do so, right? I mean, this is the time. Again, look at the last 2 cycles. This is the time where it started to pick up. So that's got to be the focus here, right? I mean, it's got to be the focus of guys, Bitcoin has been going sideways with a slight bearish bias since March, right? I mean, since March. So if it's going to follow the last couple of cycles, now's the time. If it can't, right? If it can't do that, then that's where things, could take a much different turn that people aren't necessarily expecting. Because normally, when you get a green September, Q4 is also green. We saw it happen last year. It happened in 2016. It happened in 2015. And even in 2012, where October was red, November and December were still green. And they basically gained what Bitcoin lost in October and more, I believe. I'm just going to double check that. I don't want to say it if it's not true, but if you go back and look at 2012, you can see here, October was red, and then November, December basically gained it all back, right? So, I mean, essentially, every time that Bitcoin closed September green, Q4 ended up being pretty good. And again, that is sort of the base when you think about markets. The markets generally trend higher. So if that's not the case, then there has to be a reason. And the only reason, right? The only reason, other than things that are completely unpredictable, like geopolitical stuff or black swans, right? The only reason that I can think of that could slow Bitcoin down would just be the unemployment rate, right? That's the only thing I can really think of and point to, hey, what about that? Right? Again, that's the only thing. So that's what we got a big week coming up here. And we will see, what the unemployment rate does. I mean, is this the start of a larger pullback, or is it going to go higher? My guess is that by the end of the year, the unemployment rate will be higher than it is today. If it's only marginally higher, like 4.3, 4.4, then Bitcoin might not care much about that, right? I mean, it might just sort of shrug its shoulders and be like, all right, well, I mean, it's still pretty low, right? I don't think that if by December the unemployment rate's 4.3%, Bitcoin might not care so much about that. And that, might be able to overlook that and say, look, inflation's trending to where it needs to be. It's okay. But if, on the other hand, we're looking at the unemployment rate in December, and, rather than a 4.2 or 4.3 or something, just take the last few periods where it started to really move up and overlay it, right? And that might give you an idea of where the unemployment rate could be by the end of the year, right? If it tracks some of these prior cycles, right? I mean, here you can see if it follows the one from 2000, the unemployment rate moving up, right? I mean, by the end of the year, it could be at 4.8%, right? 4.9. Now, if the unemployment rate's at 4.9 by the end of the year, it would lead me to believe that Bitcoin is still probably unable to break through the lower high structure. And again, I mean, that's just one example. And that's probably not even the best example because, the dot-com crash was definitely one of the worst ones we've seen. So let's look at one from the 90s. In the 90s, yes, there was a recession, but the S&P only dropped like 20%. It wasn't nearly as bad. But even then, I mean, the unemployment rate could still be 4.6% or something if it falls that. So, I mean, this is one of those things where it's going to be dependent on the labor market, I think. Um, and I think it's easy to sort of discount it and pretend like it doesn't matter. But I would argue that, a lot of the people that would argue that it doesn't matter would have also said that Bitcoin was going to be 100K 6 months ago, right? I mean, if you guys remember back to March, so many people were not anticipating a 2019 style drop, right? Where it's just sort of a painfully slow process of lower highs and lower lows where Bitcoin dominance goes up, right? A lot of people were not considering that. But then that's what happened, right? That's ended up what happening, what's happened. Um so I do think it matters, right? I do think it matters. In order for Bitcoin to continue this rally that it's seen the last few weeks, I think the labor market data needs to prove that things are okay. Okay. So my guess is that if the labor market data comes in and it doesn't really seem that bad, that could be a great reason for Bitcoin to make a run at the lower high structure and try to break through. If on the other hand it comes in really bad, then I mean it could just be more of the same, right? And then that could sort of then replace where people think Bitcoin is further back, right? So instead of being here at sort of the breaking of the lower high structure, it could just be that Bitcoin is here where the first rate cut occurred last cycle, where then it still trends down until it's obvious that the rate cuts are having the desired effect. Um, so that's where I stand. And I mean, like, I guess it's frustrating for people because I know a lot of the people out there just want you to tell them, like, if it's going to go up or down. But I think it's also, I think the older people get, you have to realize absolutely no one knows what's going to happen. Like, no one has a crystal ball. No one's going to be able to tell you with a straight face where the price of Bitcoin is going to be tomorrow, much less a week from now or a month from now or 3 months from now. No one knows. So I would argue that if you're following someone that's telling you without a doubt where the price of Bitcoin is going to be in 3 months, that should be a red flag because they don't know, right? They don't know. And if you need any proof, go back and look at what they were telling you was going to happen 3 months ago or 6 months ago back in March. Were those predictions correct? Probably not, right? And you could do the same thing with me, right? I get predictions wrong all the time, which is why I shy away from making them a lot of times because I know how difficult it is. I try to focus on the process, what's generally playing out. But in terms of actual price predictions, it's impossible. Yeah, I'll give you an example. For Ethereum, right? For Ethereum, I feel like my views on Ethereum recently have been fairly accurate, right? At least since March. Before that, I definitely underestimated it, right? But my argument and the way I cope is that I was still right on ETH Bitcoin, so I'm still happy that my money was in Bitcoin over ETH back then because Bitcoin outperformed Ethereum, right? So I'm happy about that. In the short term, though, what's kind of baffling to me, I'm just being honest, right? It was kind of baffling to me, is the fact that ETH is not even at its bull market support band, right? While Bitcoin has already exceeded it, right? Bitcoin's already exceeded it. Not only that, but the altcoin market, right? I mean, the altcoin market, for crying out loud, has exceeded it. So we have sort of a conundrum here, right? I mean, you have Bitcoin has broken through it, the altcoin market has broken through it. But if you include ETH in the altcoin market, it hasn't broken through. So there's one case that some people make, and that's that ETH is some people think that ETH is irrelevant and that there's sort of a changing of the guard, if you will. I disagree with that, right? I think ETH is more important than all these other altcoins, right? It's still number 2 to Bitcoin, but I still think it's number 2 for a reason, right? So, I'm not over here trying to figure out, is there a changing of the guard, which some people would argue is what I should be doing, right? I'm trying to figure out why is ETH showing so much weakness? Because if I were looking at it, I would say, well, if Bitcoin's above the 20-week and if the altcoin market's above the 20-week, why isn't ETH? Right? Why not? There's two answers, right? Answer number one is that it's going to make that move and it just hasn't done it yet. Answer number two is that there's an underlying weakness in the altcoin market that ETH is trying to tell us about. And everyone's just ignoring it because they'd rather go buy meme coins. So I mean, I guess it depends on how optimistic of a person you are, how pessimistic of a person you are, on which of those you're gonna take. But I think that's kind of the consideration, right? You know, why is ETH not at least? I mean, it's not even. Not only is it not above the 20-week, but it's not even at the 21-week EMA. I mean, it just goes to show you how weak it has been. I mean, again, like go look at some individual alts. Like look at Doge, right? I mean, it's above the 21. It's above the bull market support band. XRP is above it. ADA, it's above it. Avalanche, above it. Right? BNB, well above it. Polkadot, below it. Chainlink, slightly below. Litecoin's got to be below, right? Yeah, got to be. Solana, above it. Right above it. Just like it was here and here as well. I mean, it's only been below it a few times over the last year. Uni's got to be below it too. Right? So you can see that it's strange because Bitcoin is above it. The altcoin market collectively is above it. And normally when that happens, I wonder how many times in history that's happened where ETH is still well below it. Probably not many times at all, if at all. And I feel like we might get the answer to that soon. Like we're either going to see ETH rally to the 20-week SMA soon, or if it can't do it, it might be sort of like the what moment, right? Like the thing that everyone's sort of waiting for, and then it just doesn't happen. So we'll see where things go there. Those are my views on Bitcoin. This is your bull market support band video. Even though I don't know why I call it that, I barely even talk about it. But that's where it is right now. And we'll see if Bitcoin can sort of break through this lower high structure. And again, in the short term, if there is a pullback this week, which I mean you could already argue there's been a little one here, but if there's actually a deeper pullback, then around 61.5 to about 63K is going to be the area that the bulls are going to want to hold as support. Okay. And we'll wrap it up there. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.